All right, so I want to thank you so much, by the way, for joining our membership program called Patreon. We're going to do a lot of really great things in the next, couple of months. My plan is when it gets back to normal, and when I move back to the city, which is next Monday, we're going to do a lot of exclusive things for Patreon, both in person and anything that involves wine, and that we could do something to make your life richer and experiences better. We hope that you reach out and you ask us for help. So if you're going to Napa Valley, or if you're planning a trip to Champaign, or if you're wanting to get into a restaurant in New York City where we know somebody and it's hard to get a reservation, I hope you reach out. I mean, really, it's meant to be this inclusive, exclusive thing. So Amber has really been doing a great job with it. And we have a bunch of articles and a bunch of videos and classes and sommeliers that are going to contribute to our membership platform. So I'm very excited. As you all probably are aware, I've been sort of on maternity leave and for the last 6 months when I had a baby. And so now it's great to be back in the swing of things. So hopefully I'll see you this month at Cork Buzz if you're in New York City area. If not, we'll see each other online. So there was a lot of classes in the last 2 months on Champagne, and whether it's on chat or you want to unmute, you can feel free to tell me if you've joined these classes. I know we did a series on the villages and the regions of Champagne with Amber and Ryan. Did anyone join those? I know Venkat probably did. So this is meant to be a little bit different. That's great. I'm glad you joined them all. This is meant to be a little bit different. It's meant to be conversational. It's meant to be about experience, and it's meant to be a little bit more about a back and forth with all of us. So it's my favorite region in the world. And I think it's my favorite region in the world, Champagne, because it's the most difficult thing in the world to make. I don't probably have to tell you, but I'll just remind us that Champagne is made twice. And to me, that's incredible that you're making a base wine, something similar to the base wine of this Pinot Noir still wine that I'm drinking from Champagne. So you're making a base wine by just taking grapes and pressing them and fermenting them into wine. So sugar plus yeast equals alcohol. You guys know the drill. So this is a picture of a coquard. The coquard is this traditional press that they use in Champagne. And you can see it's quite big. This is actually a picture from the place where I worked Harvest. And this holds 4,000 kilos of grapes. So the interesting thing is, as you can see, this is big metal kind of apparatus here with these wood panels. And then it's like a wood, like a wooden ring, and you dump the grapes into this little press. And then you sort of put these bolts and metal pieces into it. And then this wood part kind of comes down and flattens and squeezes these grapes. Believe it or not, it's somewhat of a gentle press. It looks like it's like a big wooden metal thing, but the grape juice, after this press comes down twice, the grape juice flows from the sides of the slats of wood and metal, and this sort of metal basin is on the top of the winery. It's different in every winery, but this is where I worked for the couple months that I lived in Champagne. And then the gravity flow of this juice goes to the tanks underneath. And so this is like a really kind of crazy way of pressing grapes. It's not done anywhere else in the world, this big press in this style. And there's a couple of other presses that they use in Champagne. Not all wineries use coquard presses. So the best part about this was working in this environment, because we would pick the grapes all day long, and they would go into these little baskets, and then these baskets would go into the winery, and they would be weighed, And it's really, really strict in Champagne. So you have to keep like these crazy notes about how many bins you put in the cocard, and it is like the CIVC, which we can talk about in a minute. The CIVC could come by and could check your notes and could check your records to make sure that everything that the AOP, which I'm sure you learned about, the appellation laws, are being followed to a T. So anyway, I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but it's an extremely hard thing to do, because as soon as these 4,000 kilos of grapes are crushed or pushed down and the juice comes out, there's a first press, right? The beginning press, and you can imagine that first free run of juice that flows out, and then there's a second press, and the second press is the tie, or the end press, right? So of 4,000 kilos of grapes, you have 2,050 liters of juice, and then 500 liters of juice that can come from the press. And if you use after the first time you press it, you would basically get into this like large cuvee or press, and with a pitchfork, with a couple of pitchforks, you would go in there and dig the sticky paste, or like pressed grapes, and break it up again so that you can press it down again. So it was incredible because, like I said, for myself, I'd always wanted to learn about Champagne, and in 2010, I stopped working at this large corporate job that I had, and I was getting ready to start Cork Buzz in 2011. And so right before my space was in construction, which would become Union Square, I went to work in the village of Chavot, and I ended up picking grapes for 10 days, and then living at the winery and fermenting grapes and doing the blends and doing all the fermentation. Sorry. So that was one of my favorite jobs, was to get in there with a pitchfork and just like dig those out, and then get back in after the first press and then push it down again. So with that, I just wanted to show you that. So like today, we're going to talk about harvest. We're going to talk about how incredible the experience is. I really recommend you do it. We're going to talk about places to visit. You guys already know a little bit about the history of the region, but I'm going to tell you about what makes it special. And the history, of course, the location and geology. We're just quickly talking about the Champagne method, the terminology and styles, the villages and the recent vintages. So really, it's again more a conversation. Anything you want to know or any questions you have, please ask. So you're probably well aware that Champagne is located 90 kilometers north and east of Paris. The best thing that I've ever done is take my husband to go to Paris for 2 days, and then from Paris, we drove when I was with my husband, and rented a car and went to Champagne, and then back from Champagne to Paris. So let us be maybe a Patreon next trip of exploring Paris and Champagne together, because that is one of the best things we can do. Historically, as you probably are well aware, in the 1700s, Champagne was making regular still wine. They were making wine that was, because of climate, very light, very acidic, very sour. And really, even though it was, since it was so close to Paris, and it was, Champagne literally means field, or means like a big open area. It had a lot of world war. Its proximity to like the border of Germany, and its big open fields, and its location close to Paris. It came to be that a lot of war was fought on Champagne soils. And even though we think of it as a celebratory beverage, as something that we toast on weddings, on job promotions and special occasions. I think it's all about contrast in Champagne. It's the irony of contrast. So this wine that was produced at the time was thought to be inferior. You had the same grapes, Chardonnay, as and Pinot Noir, that were being made just south in Burgundy. And in Burgundy, the climate, while still cold, would ripen grapes to be a little bit more, a little bit riper in sugar, which would produce higher alcohol wine. So in the 1700s, we're talking, 1727, when still wine and the first sparkling wines start being made. These wines are like 10% alcohol, which is crazy. And the grapes, because they're such low in alcohol and it's so acidic, the wines were not really as regarded, and they weren't as sought after. And so it happens to be that, as an accident, Champagne was produced into a bubbly form. Basically, in the spring following a harvest, when grapes were fermenting into alcohol, they would notice that the yeast stopped fermenting because the temperature of the cellars would get so cold. And at that time, when the cellar temperatures got cold, the yeast would go dormant. And as soon as the yeast went dormant, they would think that the fermentation had been complete, and they would bottle these wines. And after the bottling, once it started warming up again in the later part of the spring, the yeast would come alive again, and it would still have sugar in the bottle, and the yeast would eat the sugar again the second time, and the bottles would explode because the glass wasn't strong enough at that time. So, Champagne made by accident, intentionally made in this form of secondary fermentation in the bottle today. But I think it's interesting how global warming has impacted wine in the region, because nowadays we're talking about multiple years in a row where the grapes are getting really ripe and the harvest is beautiful and plentiful. And so what used to be, 3 times in a decade that you would maybe see vintage Champagne has become more and more popular as the grapes are getting riper on their own. And so anyway, that's a little bit of the story, where we're located. Has anybody else been to Champagne?
No, we haven't. It's on our list, but we've never been there.
Great.
No, I haven't.
Great. Well, we'll have to take you there. So a little bit of a review. Did anyone else attend the classes besides Venkat? With Amber and Ryan? Okay, so I'll be mindful of you, so I'm not boring you, Venkat, but I'll talk about some of this review with the other guys. As you are aware, this is an extreme climate, like I was saying, or at least historically was. It's located in one of the northernmost parts of the northern hemisphere, where fine wine is grown, at the 48th parallel. So technically speaking, at least historically, it was a very cold climate we just discussed. The soils in the area are really unique. They're a combination of an intense chalk and clay, and the region was a seabed. So you have a lot of these fossilized, what they call coccolithophores, or this really intense crustaceans of oyster shells and soils that are rich in chalk and produce wines that have natural acidity. And the grapes that are called the Champagne grapes are 3 technically: Chardonnay for the only white grape, Meunier, and Pinot Noir. However, there are 4 forgotten grapes that we don't usually talk about that are also grandfathered in the region. And those grapes are allowed to be made into Champagne as long as you had them historically in your vineyard. So the grapes are Pinot Blanc and a grape called Fromentu, which is also known as Pinot Gris. There's a grape called Petit Arban and Petit Meselier. So, actually speaking, there are 5 white grapes because Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Petit Meuselier, and Petit Arban are all white, as long as Chardonnay is white. And in our winery where we're at harvest, we had all 7 champagne grapes in a field blend. So there are some producers that make 100% Pinot Blanc or Pinot Gris or some combination of those forgotten 4 grapes, and they're quite interesting. But speaking about the major grapes, we know that Pinot Noir is a very rich, intense red fruit, and it adds a certain structure and a certain elegance and a certain longevity to a wine. Champagne rather. So the red fruit that we know from still Pinot Noir, like in Burgundy or Sancerre, it does show through when you're drinking 100% Pinot Noir wines. For the most part, Pinot Noir is more widely planted in the area around the Montagne de Rennes, which is the mountain range near Rennes, and with Meunier is a grape that is very frost resistant. Pinot Noir is a fickle grape. You probably know it's thin skinned. I always joke, but it's very funny that Pinot Noir, if you cry in a vineyard, Pinot Noir rocks, which is to say that it's a joke, but my friends say that all the time, that it's so extremely sensitive to environment. So because it can get very rainy or cold in this area, Pinot Noir was always thought to be a bad bet in Champagne. So they needed an insurance policy, and that came in the form of Meunier. This is a grape that can grow anywhere, really, although it only finds itself in a few places. But Meunier is a little bit easier. So it grows near the valley of the Marne. So you have the Marne River here, and the area around the Marne is called the Vallée de la Marne, and that's where you find most of the Meunier. And like I said, this area is actually heavier in clay, and Meunier likes clay. You really can't mess it up. But what it does in a blend is that it adds a fruitiness. So I always find that Meunier has a broadness. So when you're drinking Meunier, you might find the richness in the middle of the palate when you're drinking based wines for that. So sometimes you'll see Pinot Noir and Meunier mixed together. Technically, if you're labeling as Blanc de Noir, you can use any combination of those two, and you don't have to note, like there's no minimum of 50% Pinot Noir or 20% Meunier. It's really allowed to be blended. So that's mostly happening in and around Epernay. The major cities are Rennes, Epernay, and Troyes, in the Aube. And then Chardonnay, it's a grape that you actually expect it to be broad and rich because you're used to California Chardonnay or Chardonnays that have in Burgundy, where you get a lot of oak use or minerality. But Chardonnay in Champagne actually is very linear. It gives you like a razor edge, sharp, sort of more on that green apple or citrus notes if you're using mostly Chardonnay in your blend. So Chardonnay is very adaptable to soil, and it's really influenced by winemakers' technique. So that's why it's such a great grape for Champagne. And for the most part, you see a lot of Chardonnay in and around the Côte de Blanc, the hillsides of white. So the 3 regions of main note are the mountain of Rennes, the valley near the Marne, and the hillside of white, or the Côte de Blanc. Then we get into these other regions that historically weren't as regarded, which are the Côte de Sézanne and the Aube, or the Côte de Bar. And these areas here, as you can notice, are so much further. The Aube River bisects the region, and the Seine River, which ends up going into Chablis. And so the Aube is the region that was what is closer to Chablis than it is the rest of Champagne. And the Aube is where I'm most excited when I'm drinking wine these days. There's a lot more grower Champagne in the Aube and more biodynamic wines being made there. It's a really wonderful, amazing place to visit. Actually, the historical capital of Champagne before Reims was the city or the region called Troyes. And to me, it's my favorite wine bar besides Cork Buzz in the world, which we're going to talk about. It's a wine bar that you must visit when you're going to Troyes, called Au Crieu du Vin. So anyway, those are our 5 major regions. In the Aube, we do see a lot of Pinot Noir as well. And the Côte de Sézanne is an area that was blended for the most part, but they have a decent amount of Chardonnay. So speaking about secondary fermentation in the bottle, besides what we learn in textbook, it's a very beautiful, amazing, incredibly difficult process, because as we know, we're going to take these grapes, whatever combination they are, we're going to press them in either the Cocard traditional press or these pneumatic presses that look like bladders. They like kind of squeeze the grapes gentle from side to side instead of up and down. And after the juice is fermented, we're going to decide whether we're going to allow it to go through malolactic fermentation or whether we're going to block malolactic. So when you talk about some champagne producers, and if you're visiting or if you're asking yourself to dig deeper into some of your favorite producers, you might just note the producers that use malolactic fermentation and those that don't. You probably know from drinking Chardonnay that sometimes when you let a wine go through malolactic, you change the profile from a green apple acid to a sort of creamy or custard style. So sometimes people in champagne, they want to take the edge off. They want to make a champagne taste less sour or less acidic or less tart. So certain producers have, either a real strong opinion that they love when they let their base wines go through malolactic, or some that say absolutely not. I don't want to take away any of that tartness and acidity. But anyway, after their decision is made, they might even say, we're going to age our base wine in oak. And it's not very common, but there are some producers that are very delicious, and we know that they're different than others because they ferment their base wines in oak. A good example is Krug. And when you taste a glass of Krug champagne, that it has that real extreme, like kind of tastes like sparkling Montrachet, right? Like sparkling white Burgundy. And the custard and the cream and the decadence that you find is like something you might want to have Krug champagne with your leg of lamb, or it's a wine more than it's a sparkling wine for sure. And that's oak aging. And there's other producers that do that. There's a wonderful wine called Villemart, Vmart. They make a wine called Cour de Cuvée, and they're oak aged. Or there's a Bollinger that uses some oak, or a producer called Alfred Gratien. So anyway, at that decision, it's most of the time done, the secondary fermentation in these stainless steel tanks or these concrete vats, and the base wine is left there. And then what they'll do is they'll start bottling and blending after the spring following the harvest. So you'll have your base wines, and then the chef du cave, the winemaker, will get together sometimes with others, and they'll taste the base wines. A lot of times, if you're a big house like Louis Roederer or let's say a Ruinart Champagne, you might have holdings that you own in these little villages, and you might also have contracts with growers where the growers bring you grapes from their village, and you'll sometimes taste the separate cuvées as still wines. So like one of our really close friends is the winemaker for Champagne Ruinart, and his name is Freddie Paniotis. I really want to get him to do a class for Champagne for us. but he is brilliant. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable men I've ever met in the world of wine. And he does like classes on tasting base wine. So he brought us samples one year, and we tasted like the base wines of all these different cuvées, and it's incredible because the fact that these winemakers can taste still wine from, let's say, villages like Aviz or Cremant or Ambonnet, and then decide, you know what, we're going to put 60% of the base wine of Ambonnet fruit and 20% from Cremant. So they're not only tasting the different grapes and the 3 main or 5 main regions, but they're even tasting wines from specific villages. And before the wine is fermented, they're sort of like fortune tellers, right? Because they're predicting, sorry if my video went off, I don't know if it did. They're predicting what the wine's going to be like before they even finish the secondary fermentation. So that's where I think it's incredible because, sorry, my video went off for no reason, because they are able to taste base wine and predict what it's going to be like when it's finished secondary fermentation. So yeah, so we have the wine, we put the starter, you know, I was there when I worked Champagne, after we did the press at night, the next day we would, in our case, we used cultured yeast. So you mix up a little grape juice with a little like sort of package of yeast, and you make a small starter, like you would make a bread starter. And then you add this yeast and fermented, you start to see it come alive. You know it's active when you start to see bubbles in your little yeast and juice starter. And then you add it to the tank. And then as the tank takes on this yeast and sugar starter, it starts fermenting the wine, and then you bottle these wines. But what you would do is you would start the secondary fermentation. If you're making, like for us, we were making that when we did it in tank, we were making what they called harvest cuvee. So we were basically fermenting a whole tank of wine at once, just so we could bottle it and drink it during the harvest. We drank like probably 10 people harvesting grapes. We drank like something like 400 bottles of this sparkling wine throughout the 10 days of harvest. It was like every single morning when we woke up, there was a bottle of this being popped. But that, of course, is not allowed in Champagne to ferment wine in bulk. So what we know about the Champagne method is that each individual bottle is going through a secondary fermentation. So the wine is bottled, there's a little bit of sugar, a little bit of yeast added to each bottle, and then the wine is allowed to rest with the yeast and that starter on its side, which is called surlat, and the wine starts fermenting a second time. And this time we have a crown cap or a soda pop top that keeps the yeast and the bubbles inside of the bottle, and it ages that way. There's minimum aging in Champagne, where you have these wines on their side for 15 months if you're making non-vintage, or for 36 months if you're making vintage. After that process of the wine aging sur lis, the yeast are breaking down in the bottle, and the breakdown of yeast is called autolysis. And autolysis, what that's going to do is give you the yeast and the custard and the richness that we know and love. So once the winemaker decides whether it's the mandate for the AOP or whether it's the style that exceeds that, they decide they're going to disgorge the wine. So we have the riddling process, which you're probably aware. Riddling means to turn the bottle to basically get the yeast from the bottle, inside the bottle, to the neck of the bottle. And after the yeast collect at the neck of the bottle, because you're gently turning the bottles a quarter turn, or you're using a machine called a gyro pellet, once the yeast is at the neck of the bottle, you can freeze the neck of the bottle and the yeast are expelled. And then you could add a little bit of dosage, or wine with a little bit of a sweetener mixed into a liter of wine. So Anyway, the interesting thing is, when I was there, we did disgorgement by hand, and it's really complicated. You can imagine, you have individual bottles, and there's like a little kind of like a hook, and you take that, what looks like a Pellegrino top, and you quickly take this, like it's almost like an art of how you move your hands, and you have the bottle pointed into, kind of looks like a birdhouse. It's like a little house, or a little like sort of yeah, I don't know, it's the way you could say it is like a birdhouse, and you point the bottle there, and you use the hook, and the hook takes off the crown cap, and the yeast go, because of the carbon dioxide, they go expelled from the bottle, and hopefully you quickly turn your hand. If you're doing it by hand, you quickly turn your hand, and you don't lose, 3/4 of the bottle. So we do these like big lunches in Champagne. Like, imagine you usually wake up for a harvest at like 6 o'clock in the morning. We were, like I said, maybe 10 people. A lot of the people that I worked with were, Europeans that did this for like 20 years. So there was a lot of Belgians, there was a lot of workers like that lived in England. There were people from all over France, and they all came, they all worked for, a lot of them were maybe in their, mid 50s and 60s. Some were young, and they all worked together at this winery each year. And so they have, at the property that I worked, which is called La Frère, they have like what normally looks like a bed and breakfast. So it's called a gîte. In the gîte, I had my own room, and a couple of other people had their own room, but there was, for the other like 6 or 7 people, they had like a big, like a B&B, where they had common, kitchen and bathrooms and such like that. And so everybody woke up at 6 a.m. They met for breakfast, and the mom, the owner of La Frère were these 2 brothers, Thierry and Aurelien's father. They both started the winery, and their mom would cook all the meals. So you go downstairs for, coffee and bread and juice, and you quickly get your shears. You're assigned like a little shear for picking grapes, and you put on your boots, and it's 7 o'clock, maybe 6:30 when you leave the gîte, and you get into these little vans, and you go to the fields to pick the grapes. So like basically it's from 6:30 to, from like 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock, you're just working in the fields, and it's very cold. So you start off with like, layers of clothes, and by mid-afternoon, at least when I was there, it was like middle of August, like maybe August 16th started harvest. And it was really cold and kind of, wet and dewy. And then by middle of the afternoon, it warmed up. But you're essentially kind of like on your like squat position. You're like bent in half, and you're these gentle hills. It's not very steep like in Côte Rôtie or Germany, where you're like on the side of a hill. So you don't even really feel how the incline is. It seems like it's flat, but there are these gentle rolling hills, and you're working in teams of 2. So let's say, Lori, you're on one side of the vine and I'm on the other side, but we're going through the vines, and we both have our shears, and we're basically like in like a crab position. We're sort of squatted down, but like picking the grapes by taking our shears and cutting them from the vine. So it's like about knee height, and putting them in these little baskets. They're like maybe that big total. And they're like the 2 of us picking the grapes on either side of the vine to make sure we don't miss any, and putting them in the little baskets. And when our basket is filled, which happens very often because they're very small, we say panier. Panier is like basically like my basket, and you're essentially telling somebody in the field that's like a runner that's running back and forth to all the different harvest teams, my basket's filled. And then they take your basket. You usually have like a stack of baskets, so it's the top basket, and they bring that to a central part of the field where they put it in like a slightly larger basket. And in this slightly larger basket, they get carted back to the winery pretty frequently, because the pressure, if you're picking grapes too much at a time, the pressure will crush the grapes on the bottom, and then you'll get essentially what you don't want, which might be a little bit of the color from the juice, from the skin. So like if you're picking Pinot Noir or Pinot Meunier, and the pressure from the top parts of the grapes are crushing the bottom grapes, then you could get some like light color in your Blanc de Blanc, which you obviously don't want. So that process of like gently picking the grapes and bringing them back to the winery, especially if you're doing it earlier in the day, the majority of the work makes it so that you can have clear wine from red grapes rather. And I see the Browns have their hand raised. So was there some great question or a thought you wanted to add?
Well, just a question, Lori. What kind of is there any automation in the picking at all anywhere in Champagne?
No, by law, you're not allowed any machine harvesting in Champagne. So all harvesting must be done by hand for the appellation. But that's a great question. So yeah, we don't allow machine harvesting in Champagne. So after this pannier process, where those grapes go to the winery, that's where they actually have like these forklift sort of somebody's at the winery with like a little forklift, and they're driving and taking the medium-sized buckets, measuring them on a scale, and then once they have a certain amount measured on a scale of kilos of grapes, then they start the press. So remember in the beginning when I said, 4,000 kilos of grapes is allowed to make 2,550 liters of wine. So they won't start the press until they have 4,000 kilos of grapes. And they measure both the cuvée, the first press, and the taille, the tail press. And those two presses have to have a combination of 2,550 liters, but it's 2,050 and 500 for the taille. So the second press, of course, is a little bit more harsh because you've already taken some of the gentle juice, but it also gives you the texture and the tannin and the sort of structure. So both are important. If you use the third press, like if you want to start the press the third time from those same grapes, usually that's made into ratafia, or sort of a style of vin de liqueur, which is made in the region. So we're back to our little fields. It was really fun. I mean, there were like maybe 2 or 3 people that worked full time in the winery, and one was like an 18-year-old kid, and he always had me playing like music, American music in the field. And it's like if you think about the Champenoise, the people, they're incredibly generous and happy, and they're farmers. A lot of what we know about Champagne are these big houses like Veuve Clicquot or Moet Chandon, but really there are 20,000 farmers that make up the majority of the grape growers in Champagne. A lot of them have just small holdings. So one of the things that we experience working at a grower Champagne, which we call récoltant manipulant. So the grower Champagne labels will have an RM. So I worked for a grower, and they owned their own vineyards. So we were mostly in the Vallée de la Marne. There's a village called Chavaux, which is not Grand Cru or Premier Cru, but they had holdings in Verzy and Verzenay, and they had a little bit of holdings in Cremant in the Côte de Blanc. But the majority of their vineyards were here. They also managed grapes for other people. And the running joke was whenever we were in the fields picking our own grapes, because imagine like Moet Chandon, they have a lot of their own vines, but they also buy grapes. So they're not going to send a harvest team to pick 3 rows of vines if they own a little plot. So they have contracts with these small growers, and they allow the growers to pick the grapes for them, and generally they'll separate them and bring them into the winery. Maybe they'll press them. So the joke was my family was so proud that they owned their own vines, and we would go into these fields and you would see how alive they were, like monoculture. You would see like ladybugs, you would see like snails on the grapevines. You would see like flowers and plants growing in between the vines. And it was just like the fields were alive, right? My family, they weren't practicing biodynamics, but they definitely were organic farming. But, because the vineyards are so fragmented, if your neighbor is using pesticides or chemical fertilizers, it's very hard to keep that from runoff in your own vineyard. So there's not really a lot of certified, it doesn't make sense to be certified in like organic or biodynamic. So, but in practice, it was really cool because when one day we were working and they didn't say, oh, we're going to pick Moet Chandon vine grapes right today. But all of a sudden you got to a row of vine and you noticed that it wasn't as alive. Like the berries were smaller. Everything looked the same. There were no like ladybugs or any of these things that made you feel like, wow, like this is like the fields are allowed to do whatever they want. And so when we, like I was so energized and so such a student of wine. I think I passed my master's the year before. So in 09 I passed, and then 10 I worked harvest. And so I was always asking these questions and they were saying as a joke, but I think in this case it was serious. I was like, what happened? Like these vines are not the same as ours. We've been picking for 10 days and what's going on? And they joke and they say Cuvée Dom Perignon, which is funny because they were basically saying like all of the vines that you think look like bad or crap are, prestige cuvee for this big house. And actually there was, that was the father just kind of like, poking fun at the large Grand Marque. It wasn't technically Dom Perignon. I actually love Dom Perignon. I think it's delicious. So don't get me wrong. But the joke was that all the growers would talk about the large houses as if they were like the evil empire. And all the large houses would talk about the growers like they were farmers, like hicks, So when I went to visit my other second favorite, well, I think he's equally my favorite, Chef du Cave. He's a winemaker named Jean-Baptiste Lacaillon. He's from Roederer. And he is like, he's like a golden man. He's like smile lights up the room, and he's just such a fun and energized person. And so he works for Louis Roederer. He worked in America making Roederer the domestic property in Mendocino, and he's just like a wealth of knowledge. But he was showing me in 2010 because there was a lot of rain, and it rained during harvest, and he was showing me when he was receiving all the growers their little paniers filled with grapes that they were trying to sell to him. He was at like in the driveway essentially at the press waiting for growers to come drop off their grapes, and he would have this beautiful top of a panier filled with perfect grapes, and then he would take off the top, and then on the bottom there would be like grapes that were split, grapes that had like certain like gray rot or mold. And so the point of him showing me how careful you have to be as a large house when you're buying grapes from farmers, and he would reject these that were not perfect, is just the whole art of the difference between, there are great growers that their name is on the bottle, like Baresh that you guys are drinking, and they have such pride in making their wines that represent their name. And then there are some small grape growers that, they know they're going to always sell their grapes, and maybe they're concerned about getting paid, which is important. And then there are large houses that definitely, maybe they take shortcuts because they're making so much wine. But then there are large houses that are committed to quality, and they have the money and the marketing and the means to only buy the best grapes. So I think both are very important in the discussion around Champagne. So that's that. 17 Grand Crus and villages. The interesting thing is that the entire village is rated as Grand Cru or Premier Cru in Champagne, and not the vineyard like Burgundy, and not the house like Bordeaux. So, and actually the entire village would be considered the Grand Cru. And by practice, the CIVC, which is the Comité Interprofessionnel de Vente de Champagne, there used to be this collection of basically grape growers and chefs de cave and owners of wineries. And it was like they decided based on the harvest, the price of the grapes for the year. And depending on your classification, if you were Grand Cru or Premier Cru, you would get a percentage of the price that the CIVC set for a kilo of grape for that year. Now that's not the case, but at the time, if you were Grand Cru, you would get 100% of the price. And now the CIVC is more of like a governing body that just helps with quality and does a lot of research, but they don't set the price. Now it's an open market where the price that you want to sell your grapes for is not mandated by, you know, the governing body. So with that, are there any other questions or thoughts so far?
So just a quick question on the harvest that you were talking about. I know there's a selection and sorting process later, but when you're actually in the field picking grapes, is there any sorting or any selection that you do there? Like, are there grapes that you won't pick because they don't look good enough or ripe enough? And then also, do you pick everything in a single go, or do you come back multiple times?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the most part, you do pick everything in a single go. Like it's not like the trees that you find in Sauterne where you're looking for like botrytis and you're going back in multiple picks. But with that said, like there are certainly producers that make cuvées that their intention is to keep the grapes maybe a little bit longer. You know, they are definitely picking you know, parts of their vineyards first. So if they have like for example, Philippinot, they have a single vineyard cuvée called Clos de Goisse, and they pick that last because they want it to be the ripest because it's the broadest of style. So you wouldn't really pick within a vineyard like in multiple trips, but you might pick within your villages in multiple trips. So you might pick like Cremant first because it's on one side of the hill and it's the curb side where it gets more sunshine, and then you might pick your village Avis. So it's really like more about villages at a time and your holdings within those villages. But to answer your question about whether you're sorting sort of visually in the field, absolutely. And I think, again, that goes back to the grower and how committed they are to getting good grapes. So we would pick only grapes that didn't have any like tears or rips or any sort of splits, because more so than in other wine, you know, it's really important that the grapes that go in the press are healthy, because it's essentially like champagne will show all of its flaws. And the less perfect grapes, or the ones where you're making just massive amounts, that's where they need to have a lot of, as the winemakers say, makeup. So they use dosage more in those bigger cuvées. Like, not that I'm getting any negative thoughts on Veuve Clicquot, but as we know, Veuve Clicquot has a certain amount of heavy dosage, and it's perhaps because of the volume that they have to produce to make yellow label, that they have this, they buy a lot of grapes and they make a lot of wine, and they use a lot of sugar to kind of cover up some of the imperfections. So we definitely sorted, especially that year. They said in 2009, because it was such a beautiful harvest, that you could literally have your pickers blindfolded and they would just take their shears and just pick all the fruit and dump it into the panier. But in 2010, they had a old vine cuvée of this Meunier that they used to make a Sanier, like a rosé from only the old vines. And they literally picked like 3 of us and said, you 3, we watched you pick and we know how committed you are to quality. You're the only 3 that can pick the Sanier for the Meunier old vine. And so we would go, and like everyone else was picking for the rosé, but we were picking for the old vine, and we only literally had to take every cluster. And the grapes are really tight together. So the clusters, especially Meunier, they're very tight. So if you get any little rot inside of the cluster, we would just leave it in the field for birds or whatever. So great.
Interesting. And one more question, actually, if you don't mind.
don't-
When you're talking about a quality-oriented producer like Laura Fair, if you do want to be a picker for just one harvest, is there any sort of qualifications that you need, or is there sort of a training process that happens before you actually do the harvest?
Yeah, it's great. Well, as you know, I did only one harvest, and the reason I was able to do it was because I knew the importer and distributor, and because I had the qualifications of like sommelier, and they allowed me to do it. But even then, it was very difficult because the jobs in the EU are so sought after, because they are paid so well, and you have to get like a work permit to work in France, and actually it's hard to get as an American. So I basically, I don't know why my video is turning off accidentally, but so I basically had to lie and not get paid, which I didn't care because I just wanted the work experience. And if the CIVC were to come to the field while we were working, they would check your permit, and I would hide because I wasn't supposed to be there. So the short answer is I was not trained in, like, they didn't, require a lot for me to do it, but I really wasn't supposed to be there. So actually it's funny because at the day after the 10 days of harvest, I ended up staying longer and living there for a while and doing the blends and such. But everybody that worked the harvest, since they do it all the time, they lined up outside of the winery. I mean, they got paid like something like, I feel like they made like 4,000 euro each for like 10 days of work. And honestly, all 3 meals are paid for. You're staying at the winery, you're just partying. Like basically after the harvest, these guys like flipped each other's beds. Like they were drinking champagne all night. They have this thing at the end of the harvest where in the villages, they like put the cars, they take the cars and they put them on like cement blocks. Like they have like flares. I mean, it's like this crazy party after. I forgot the name of what they call the party. Oh, Kokale is the party after the harvest. And every grower has different Kokale. Like they have music, they have all these things. So, but everybody was lined up for their money. And I was like, I wasn't feeling bad, but I was unemployed because I quit my corporate job and I was starting my own business. So it's kind of like, oh, I really like working harvest, but everybody else gets like these big fat, cash. And I was going to explore Paris for a little bit. So I was feeling bad for myself, but then the winemaker said, oh, I'm going to pay you in champagne. And they gave me a 20 liter of a Nebuchadnezzar. This is the biggest bottle that you can get in champagne. And it was funny because we opened the Nebuchadnezzar of champagne from Laura Frère on my first New Year's Eve of Cork Buzz, because we had a massive party at Cork Buzz. So I said, when am I ever going to use this Nebuchadnezzar of champagne? So there's probably a YouTube video of us opening this 20 liter bottle on the New Year's. It would have been New Year's of like 2012, because we opened in 11, but it was the following year, and the winery shipped it via my friend. That's a very long-winded answer, but the point is, if you really wanted to work at Laura Frère, I might be able to sneak you in. But it's very difficult to get a job as an American because all the jobs they're very sought after. But all right, so this is the end of our discussion. This is what I recommend we all do. I'm going to send you the notes, and of course, this presentation. You probably know this, but 3 to 5 days, the perfect long weekend. Champagne, Paris to Champagne. This is what I'm recommending for homework. You can fly into Charles de Gaulle or Paris Orly. They're both about 26 kilometers from the center of Paris. You can also take like a very quick taxi from the airport to the metro directly, which is what I did the first time. So I land in Paris and I took a taxi to the Gare de l'Est, and then you take a high-speed train, the TGV, which is about 90 miles, and you get there in 45 minutes. And then you arrive in Reims from Paris. So I did that the first time when I worked Harvest. It's super easy. There's like 40 something trains that run it each day. It's like very cool to grab a baguette and some saucisson and get on the train in the Gare de l'Est and go to Reims. I recommend that. The second time when I went with my husband, we actually picked up a car after our Paris trip and rented a car and drove to Champagne, and it's about an hour and a half. So obviously the opposite is true when you're going from Champagne back to Paris. Do not do what we did, which we put regular gasoline in a diesel car 10 minutes after leaving Champagne because we were very hungover on our way to Paris. And then the car, of course, stopped working and we had to get towed from some random, like small little farm village outside of Champagne to Paris and almost missed our flight, but it made for a good story. I'll tell you the long version one day. I have my favorite places, so I'm going to share this with you all as Patreon members, places that you must see in all these towns. So again, you don't have to furiously write these. I will absolutely share this. But in each of these places, we have to explore. So like I always go to this shop, which is like one of the coolest taxiderm places, and buy fun things like whatever you can imagine you might want. That's a very cool thing to do in Paris. Then go to Delaran if you haven't been. It's the world's greatest kitchen supply store ever. I bought all my copper pots and pans for like nothing there. You can buy like knives, black cast iron pans, dirt cheap. Delaran is definitely a place to visit. And then I put things like the oldest cinema in Paris, where you can buy a movie ticket and you get access to the secret rooftop. It's where I always go. This like jazz club where you can go and listen to swing bands, and it's really cool in the Rive Gauche. And then all my favorite basically places like to drink. Of course, La Tour d'Argent is like, you can find the expensive wines that we love, and we can't get even one bottle at Cork Buzz, like just literally tons of them, like Raveneau and all these great producers of Côte-Rôtie. And so not only champagne, but La Tour d'Argent, Willie's Wine Bar, a great place to eat, Au Pied du Cochon. My favorite place that I've ever been, where I took my husband for his birthday, right when we landed in Paris, Bistro Chez Michel. Actually, a winemaker from Drapier recommended it. It's like the most simple bistro, the most amazing place I've ever been. So Bistro Chez Michel, some somewhat moderate, fancy places to sleep. So I'll share that with you. And then what I would do is I would go from Paris to Reims. I actually made this day the big house day. If you want any connections to visit Roederer, I can definitely get you in. Runard as well. But I say you do Reims, you go to the cathedral in Notre Dame where all the kings were crowned. This is like the cathedral that was burned down in the World War. And basically there's like one single pane of glass that's like left over from the original. It's such an amazing place. So spend the day walking along the cathedral. If you want, the best place to stay is actually not there's great places to sleep, these hotels, but I have an Airbnb, which basically the Airbnb that I stayed looks out the window at the cathedral, and the family that owns it is incredible. They rent it all the time. So if you're going, you should stay with them. When we went, they opened like 10 bottles of champagne. Like they said, come over for a coupe de champagne. We were looking at the cathedral out their window, and they were like serving us oysters. And it was like, we paid something like $120 a night. It was insane. So I definitely recommend that. There's these 2 wine shops. You can find like some of the best champagne that's not imported, fine dining, and Japanese, like kind of modern, super cool place called Racine. So just things like go spend a day in Reims, do the big caves. Maison Runard has like this sick underground cave where they have like little carvings in the chalk caves of like people like making altars to pray to during World War when everyone was inverted under the cave. So it's incredible to see some of the deepest and oldest caves in Champagne. And then of course Roederer, just because I think it's one of the best. It's a large house, but one of the best. and crude because they're oak aged and they're so different than the rest. And then in Epernay, I say do like the smaller growers. I have, this is a picture of Aurelian that I worked harvest with. Go and see La Frere. It's not in Epernay. Some of these are not in Epernay, but if you stayed in Epernay, these are some growers and some bigger houses like Bollinger to visit. You can go and see the Avenue de Champagne and explore all the underground chalk cellars. They're about like 110 kilometers. Stay at this either of these beautiful like hotels. Go to Sitcom, which is a wine bar with snacks. Fine dining in DZ between Rennes and Epernay. And then my favorite, go to the Aube. You have to visit producers like Vouet Sorbet, Marie Cortan, one of the bigger, but they're not big at all, Drapier. These are the visits in this southern part of Champagne. But this is a place called Au Creux du Vin, which is one of the first like natural wine bars in what used to be Troyes is the main city. And La Creux du Vin is a destination. Every single cool wine that you can't get, they're literally on the shelf. It looks like a wine shop, and then they serve the best like saucisson and simple food the owner's mom makes. You have to make a reservation. It's like the only place to eat in Troyes, but they also have a small outpost at the Marché des Halles, which is the market. You can go see the regional park. So this is my recommendation. I'll share that with you. And with that, I think it's time to say goodnight. Stop recording. Any other questions? Let me stop it.
Laura,
Yes.
you were talking about wine and food. If you were organizing a dinner around champagne, what would you match it up with other than an obvious choice like shellfish?
Yeah, no, I honestly, the best dinner that I've ever attended was Pebble Beach Food and Wine Festival. There was a vertical tasting of Cristal going back to like 1979, I believe. And so it was like current vintage 04, at the time it was like 2004, I think. But and it was 5 Michelin starred chefs that cooked the dinner. So it was like Eric Ripert and Jean George and Daniel Hume from 11 Madison Park. And it was a course meal from crudo to baby goat with champagne. So my opinion is champagne is a wine before more than it's a sparkling wine. So the Blanc Blancs, like with crudo, like when we opened, we had a crudo of hamachi with grapefruit and endive, and that's perfect for Blanc Blanc. And you can have like a fried oyster, of course, with like something like a Blanc de Noir. But when you get into like the oak aged and the long lees aging, recently disgorged champagnes, I mean, like I said, you could have that with Lori, you could have that with anything from hanger steak with a rosé to a big burger with like tons of richness, like DB Bistro. When they first opened, they used to do this foie gras burger, and we would go and drink Bicart, like the Billicart Salmon rosé with this like foie gras rich burger. And I mean, honestly, we say pizza champagne, one of the best pairings, but in all honesty, it's one of the wines that you can never go wrong with the pairing. So yeah, I would say soup to nuts, champagne all day. Fried chicken especially. All right, guys, well, have a great night. I'll see you soon, hopefully in person or the next virtual class. Have a great night.
Thanks for doing
Thanks,
this.
Laura.
Bye.
Bye, Laura.